forests, and embodied carbon. My name is Jason Grant. I make my living as a consultant, but I'm also a longtime Sierra Club volunteer, chair of the club's Forest and Climate team, and I represent Sierra Club on the board of the U.S. Office of the Forest Stewardship Council. I'm joined today by Dr. Dominic de la Sala. Dominic is a scientist and heads up the GEOS Institute located in Ashland, Oregon. His professional engagements and accomplishments are too numerous to cover here, but suffice it to say that he has deep expertise in the topics covered in this program and played a major role in developing its content. We'll cover a lot of ground in this program. I'll be delivering the majority of it, and Dominic will offer remarks and participate in Q&A at the end. You can type questions into the chat box at any time. We won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll address as many as we can. Okay, let's dive in. I don't think it'll be news to any of you that forests are vital for people, wildlife, and a healthy environment. They're home to more plants and animals than any other terrestrial biome. They purify the air we breathe and filter the water we drink. They mitigate flooding by acting as giant sponges, soaking up and gradually releasing rainwater. They build soil, prevent erosion. In short, it'll be very tough to get by without them. Forests also play a central role in regulating local and regional
Just lost the audio. The audio might be back. I just heard someone grumbling under.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Is the audio back? Okay.
Yes.
Jeez Louise. Okay. That is unfortunate. All right. Let's reboot here. Okay. All right, thanks for your patience. I'm going to start over here, then saying that forests can play a central role in regulating local and regional climates by creating and cycling rainfall. And at a global level, they're one of the keys to solving the climate crisis, both because they store vast quantities of carbon already, and because they have the potential to mitigate global warming by drawing down a significant portion of the excess carbon now in the atmosphere. In a recent report, an environmental group called Dogwood Alliance notes that forests are the only proven system that can safely remove and store enough carbon dioxide to keep global temperature rise below the limit needed to avoid the worst effects of climate change. Forests are engines of carbon sequestration. Because they breathe in CO2 and exhale oxygen, they're commonly referred to as the lungs of the world. Trees use sunlight to convert CO2 to sugar, which is carbon-based and combines with other ingredients to make wood and grow the tree. The chemical composition of wood is about half carbon that will remain safely socked away until the tree dies or is cut down and its wood rots or burns. Because trees sequester carbon and store it in wood, many people promote wood as a climate solution. A prominent example is the recent surge of interest in using wood to construct mid and high-rise buildings, where mass timber products like cross-laminated timber, or CLT, can substitute for the steel and concrete traditionally used in the structure of taller buildings. For those who don't know, CLT is a very large wood panel made up of multiple layers of softwood lumber stacked at right angles and glued together. CLT panels are engineered and made to specification in the factory for a given project and shipped to the job site where the building is assembled. The core rationale behind the promotion of mass timber products is that substituting wood for steel and concrete can reduce a building's embodied carbon. Embodied carbon is calculated by totaling emissions associated with the extraction, manufacture, transport, use, and disposal of building materials. Given that a huge number of buildings are expected to be constructed in coming decades, reducing their embodied carbon is urgent, and substituting wood for non-renewable materials seems like an obvious way to make progress. The assumption is that if wood displaces concrete, steel, and other energy-intensive materials in building construction, the avoided emissions could be significant. What generally gets left out of considerations of the claimed advantages of wood use, however, is the impact of logging on forest carbon. And much of this program will focus on this critical missing piece, without which the true climate impacts of the production and use of wood products can't be understood. As the name suggests, forest carbon refers to all of the carbon stored in the forest, including what's above ground in live and dead trees and other vegetation, as well as carbon stored below ground in roots and soil. Logging results in losses of forest carbon at all scales, from individual trees to forest stands to entire landscapes. Logging causes the near-term release of much of the carbon stored in trees as roots rot and logging slash, such as branches, leaves, and needles, decomposes or burns. More is lost as the log is processed into wood products and the downfall rots or is burned for power. Only about a third of the carbon in the tree is carried through to the end of the processing chain and stored in wood products. When forest stands are logged, there's a loss of carbon in soils as well as vegetation. For those not familiar with the term, a stand is a limited and distinct area of forest that is subjected to a specific set of management techniques. The severity of the carbon loss from logging a forest stand depends on its intensity. Clear-cutting results in a greater loss than selective harvesting does. The loss is greatest if the forest was mature before it was logged. Replacing old growth with a plantation can result in up to a 60% loss of forest carbon stores that will not be made up over time if, as is typical, the plantation is subsequently relogged every 40 or 50 years. Also, in the first 15 to 20 years after replanting, a clear-cut stand emits more carbon into the atmosphere than is reabsorbed by the growth of new trees, largely because of the continuing loss of soil carbon. Industrial logging across large areas can be a major source of CO2 emissions, especially when it converts natural forests to intensively managed tree farms. Logging accounts for 85% of emissions from U.S. forests, more than 5 times those from forest conversion, fire, wind, insects, and natural tree mortality combined. In Oregon, clear-cutting millions of acres since 2000 generated 16 to 32% of total emissions from all industrial sectors, making logging one of the state's biggest carbon polluters. Industrial logging, in evaluating the embodied carbon of wood relative to other materials, the tool used to calculate and compare cradle-to-grave emissions, life cycle assessment, or LCA, typically does not account for any reductions in forest carbon stores that may be caused by logging. Most LCA studies assume that the impact of logging on forest carbon is neutral, The theory being that in managed forestry, emissions and sequestration are generally in balance. Reliable methods for calculating the impacts of logging on forest carbon and factoring them into LCAs for wood products are being pursued but do not yet exist. The results of LCAs for products are reported in Environmental Product Declarations, or EPDs, and the fact that what happens in the forest is left out of the accounting means that the carbon footprint reported in today's wood EPDs may be wildly inaccurate. The notion that all wood is forest carbon neutral is a vast oversimplification that ignores the starting condition of the forest and the type of forestry practiced. According to one recent study, depending on the assumptions going into calculations of the carbon footprint of wood, current estimates of the benefits of substitution may be greatly exaggerated. While the actual benefits of substitution are uncertain, we know for sure that if younger forests are allowed to grow instead of being cut down, emissions of forest carbon will be kept to a minimum, and they will continue to sequester CO2 in ever larger amounts for a very long time. Recently, scientists have begun referring to this process as proforestation, and are elevating it as one of the safest, most effective, and low-cost approaches to carbon removal and storage available. Proforestation is even more important as a climate solution than planting new trees, also known as afforestation, because the latter won't make much of a difference in the next couple of decades, when action to avert runaway climate change is most crucial. This is because small trees just don't sequester and store all that much carbon. You may have heard that young trees grow faster than older ones, and this is true. But what really matters isn't the rate of carbon removal, but rather the quantity. A 5-year-old sapling grows fast, but it's so little that the amount of wood it adds every year is comparatively small. A 100-year-old tree grows slower than a sapling, but it's much bigger. So a lower growth rate translates into a larger amount of wood added and carbon stored. Old trees store the most carbon. One study found that in natural forests around the world of all types, half of the carbon is stored in the largest 1% of trees. Another frequently heard argument is that mature forests are quote-unquote decadent and stop absorbing carbon. So we should cut them down and plant new trees. It's a fact that as forests age, emissions from tree mortality gradually increase until eventually, when the forest reaches the old growth stage, emissions and sequestration more or less come into balance as the carbon stored in vegetation peaks and plateaus. But when the forest is logged, we lose a lot of that stored carbon into the atmosphere, and it will take a long time to reabsorb it. Since what matters most is avoiding emissions and maximizing carbon removal and storage in the near term, it makes no sense to replace old forests with young tree farms. Doing this creates a massive carbon debt that will only be recouped if the plantations are left alone for hundreds of years. Now let's change gears and look at how different approaches to forest management can impair or enhance a forest's capacity to remove and store carbon. It's relatively straightforward to visualize how this works at the level of an individual forest stand. This chart represents two different starting conditions. The dark green line is an old growth forest, and the light green line, an agricultural field where trees are planted. With the old growth, forest carbon starts high and drops steeply when it's logged, while with afforestation, it starts low and builds for several decades. The stand represented here is logged once every 40 years on a sustained yield basis where tree growth and timber removals are in balance. The level of forest carbon drops with each harvest and then builds back up before the pattern repeats. On average, it stays about the same. However, the picture gets more complicated at the landscape level where numerous stands are being managed simultaneously. Visualize the managed forest as a bucket and forest carbon is the water inside it. The landscape is made up of multiple stands that have been logged at different times and are in different stages of regrowth. Some are taking up carbon and some are releasing it. The challenge is to determine how all these offsetting inputs and outputs affect overall carbon stores. And we need to do that to understand the differing effects of different approaches to forest management. As I've noted, carbon stores are highest in old growth forests, also known as primary forests, where there's been no logging. The water in the bucket is at or near the top. This level is never static, however. The bucket has leaks. Trees are constantly dying and rotting, releasing carbon into the atmosphere. But even a leaky bucket can hold water as long as water is being poured into it. At the same time that carbon is being emitted from the forest, it's constantly being absorbed from the atmosphere. As I said before, the amount of water in an old growth bucket will remain fairly constant over time. When the forest is logged, it impacts both the amount coming into the bucket and the amount leaking out, but the larger impact is on the leakiness. The more holes you have and the bigger they are, the leakier the bucket. And the leakier the bucket, the less carbon it will store. In this analogy, the number of holes represents the frequency of logging, and the size of the holes is related to its intensity or severity. The large clear cuts characteristic of conventional industrial forestry can be pictured as bigger leaks, and the relatively frequent harvest can be pictured as more numerous leaks. On the other hand, less intensive logging that occurs less frequently can be pictured as smaller, more numerous ones. As trees regrow after logging, more carbon gradually flows in, less escapes, and the level in the bucket gradually builds back up. But each time logging occurs, the bucket again gets leakier, and the carbon level falls back down. And again, the more intensive and frequent the logging, the farther it will fall, and the lower the average level will be. If there is a transition to climate-friendlier forestry, on the other hand, the holes get smaller and less frequent, and the bucket becomes less leaky. The average level will build up and remain higher so long as the management system is continued. Forest carbon stores are significantly increased. As I noted before, roughly a third of the carbon stored in harvested trees is carried over in wood products and can be stored for decades in buildings and other long-lived applications. This too represents a carbon store that can increase over time if the number of wood buildings also increases. And if in fact there are reduced overall emissions as a result of substituting wood for more energy-intensive materials, this substitution benefit will accumulate with time as well. However, any potential gains are offset when logging to produce the wood results in significant net decreases in levels of forest carbon. If, on the other hand, the wood used in building construction comes from improved forestry practices that build up forest carbon, then any substitution benefits will be magnified. Thus, improving forest management and increasing forest recovery and protection are key to mitigating climate change. The steps we need to take are as follows. First, logging of the world's remaining intact primary forest must cease. Forest carbon stores are highest where there's little or no logging. Therefore, we should permanently protect primary forests, particularly, but not limited to those that are the most carbon rich. And in the U.S., these are mostly found on federal forest lands. Second, protection should be extended to allow for proforestation of wide areas of previously logged forests, letting them grow back and recover their ecological and carbon storage potential. In some cases, this process of recovery can be speeded through human intervention aimed at true restoration. Where logging continues, it needs to become less intensive. For example, selective logging or smaller, more widely distributed clear cuts, and higher levels of retention, which is to say, leaving more live trees behind after a timber harvest. Another key is lengthening rotations, which is to say the time interval between cuts. Tree plantation should not be established at the expense of natural forests. Because complex forest ecosystems store more carbon than plantations and are more resilient in the face of climate change, many existing plantations should be restored to a more natural condition. Finally, afforestation is desirable because it brings carbon benefits and will increase wood supply in the longer term. But, as has been noted, it takes decades for newly planted trees to achieve the levels of carbon removal and storage that can be realized much more quickly through proforestation and a large-scale transition to climate-friendlier forestry. Reforms such as these would not only improve the management of forest carbon, they would yield numerous other important environmental benefits, including less damage to wildlife habitat, relatively higher ecological complexity and biological diversity, and reduced negative impacts on soil and water quality. As it happens, what is better for carbon is better for all of the other critical ecosystem values and services forests provide. We can't solve the climate crisis without increasing forest protection. What's left of primary forests in the U.S. are largely on federally owned lands where significant but incomplete conservation agreements have secured some protections. We need to protect them completely, and this is why Sierra Club advocates for the creation of a forest carbon reserve on public lands that would identify and protect carbon-dense primary forests, as well as areas suitable for proforestation, restoration, or afforestation. Along with increased protection on public lands, we need to change our approach to working forests. Climate-friendlier forestry requires a long-term view of forest management and an appreciation for the full array of environmental and social benefits that healthy forests offer. There's a trade-off between maximizing the short-term financial return on managed forests and enhancing the carbon and other environmental benefits of forestry. Unfortunately, our financial system favors quick returns and drives detrimental short-term thinking and practice. Businesses bent on maximizing profit, clear-cut, replant, and log again on short rotations because of the time value of money. Basically, potential future income gets discounted such that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, and $1 in 50 years is worth a whole lot more than $1 in 100 years. By contrast, climate-friendlier forestry requires a willingness and ability on the part of landowners to defer profits into the future. If they do, it's possible not only to increase carbon stores, but also to increase sustainable timber yields. To illustrate this, here's a graph showing average annual timber growth of a managed Douglas fir forest. The dark gray bar shows that the forest is at peak productivity at about 90 years. Acre for acre, the 90-year-old stand is nearly twice as productive as a 40-year-old stand. So why are most private industrial forest landowners cutting the forest before it's most productive? The reason is that we discount the future such that the financially optimal timber harvest falls at about 45 years, yielding a third less timber per acre per year than the forest could be producing. The overarching problem here is that modern industrial timber companies usually have a fiduciary obligation to prioritize return on investment over all else, including timber output. The only forest resource typically valued and monetized is timber. Our markets tend to ignore nearly every other forest value, including carbon storage. Because the greatest barrier to the uptake of climate-friendlier forestry on private lands is financial, any solutions must shift the economics. There are three main ways to do this. Raise the level of the playing field by strengthening government regulation. Incentivize change through policies that price carbon at a level that makes it financially attractive to forest owners to improve. And third, by rewarding it through the marketplace, such as by buying forest carbon credits or sourcing products certified to relatively high standards. We all have an idea of how government regulations work, but pricing carbon as a way to underwrite improvements in forest stewardship is less widely understood. One way to do this is through a cap-and-trade system. At the most basic level, how this works is you tax polluters and use the proceeds to pay for activities that reduce emissions or remove and store carbon, which can include forest conservation and stewardship. For example, California has a cap-and-trade program that imposes limits on the emissions of the state's largest polluters, such as utilities and large industrial plants. Companies that exceed the cap have to purchase carbon credits, and one place they can go to buy them is a landowner who is practicing climate-friendlier forestry. In order to garner carbon credits for sale, forestry operations have to go through a process to become a registered forest carbon project. This includes making long-term, legally binding commitments to forest management that will result in increased carbon stores over what would happen at the regulatory floor. And the more carbon stored, the more credits you can sell. So you get paid for creating a less leaky, fuller bucket. For example, a decade ago, an organization called the Redwood Forest Foundation purchased 50,000 acres of forest land in Northern California that had been severely damaged and depleted by past logging. They put the land into a conservation easement that protects the forest in perpetuity. Trees must be allowed to grow to 100 years old before they can be cut, and timber harvests are limited to no more than 3% of the total inventory, low enough so the forest will recover, timber volumes will increase, and stores of forest carbon will build up over time. They were able to register and sell credits for over 3 million tons of carbon that accumulated between 2007 and 2014. Forest certification can be another way to incentivize climate-friendlier forestry. Among the available forest certification systems, the FSC best reflects and supports climate-friendlier forestry. Among other things, FSC standards protect old growth and require less intensive practices than are permitted by law. An environmental organization called EcoTrust recently released a study that compared outcomes under business-as-usual forestry at the regulatory floor with those of FSC-certified forests in Oregon and Washington. EcoTrust found that FSC always stored more carbon, between 25 and 60% more on average. They also found that FSC could increase yields on a per-acre basis, but that this was offset by reduced yields resulting from higher levels of protection. For example, FSC requires wider stream buffers than business as usual in Oregon, taking substantial areas of land out of timber production to protect water quality. Buying FSC certified wood products is the most straightforward way I know of to support climate-friendlier forestry. But in some cases, people find that sourcing FSC is impractical. If your wood is going to come from conventional forestry, you could still incentivize the change we need by buying carbon credits from registered forest carbon projects. Registries, such as the one shown here, list a wide variety of projects where credits can be purchased. Sourcing good wood and supporting climate-friendlier forestry is key, but it's equally important to avoid wood that's tied to forest degradation and destruction, and the very worst wood comes from illegal logging. Is illegal wood being used inadvertently in building construction and elsewhere? It's actually quite likely, because illegal logging is far more pervasive and the trade in illegal wood much larger than most people think. Particularly if you are using woods harvested in developing countries, products such as plywood, flooring, and the hardwood veneer and lumber used in interior millwork may contain illegal wood. An estimated 50 to 90% of all forestry activities in key producer countries in the tropics is illegal. There are also high rates of illegal logging in Russia, parts of Eastern Europe. An estimated 20 to 50% of all timber traded internationally is illegal or high risk. And illegal logging in the associated trade in wood products represents the world's third largest transnational crime, only after counterfeiting and drugs. Illegal logging is a major contributor to deforestation. Loggers build roads in the previously inaccessible areas of forest, paving the way for conversion by providing access to farmers and ranchers. And forests that have been robbed of their most valuable timber are more likely to be burned and converted to other uses than are unlogged or managed forests. This has major consequences for the climate. Deforestation is one of the largest sources of greenhouse gas emissions, contributing up to 20% of the global total. The problems underlying the illegal wood trade are deep-seated and systemic. Illegal wood gets mixed with legal material toward the top of global supply chains, and once this has happened, it's very hard to detect. Furthermore, current methods most commonly used by law-abiding companies to mitigate the risk of sourcing illegal wood, such as gathering documents or conducting audits, have fundamental weaknesses. Documents are notoriously easy to fake, and auditors who generally pre-schedule their visits can be duped. Even the best forest certification systems are constrained in their ability to effectively screen out illegal wood. Obviously, the state of affairs poses tough challenges for those who don't want to buy illegal wood. How do you avoid what you can't reliably identify? Well, here's an answer. You can support the development of scientific solutions that resist gaming and are being developed by a global network intent on cracking down on forest crime. This is the goal of a new LEED pilot credit that rewards the use of emerging technologies for wood identification and traceability. The experts who designed this credit have pioneered a new cutting-edge approach that we call Declare, Map, and Test. The first step is declare. Suppliers provide declarations identifying the wood species and country of origin for all wood products used on a project. The second step is map. Suppliers provide maps that more precisely identify where the timber was harvested. And the final step is test, using scientific techniques to check the information provided in declarations and maps. At the heart of this approach are testing methods that can identify the species and geographic origin of wood products. If wood suppliers are required to declare this information and to back it up with maps of source forests, then these claims can be scientifically assessed. A hurdle to making this approach work is that wood identification testing can only be used to verify declarations of species or origin if you have the reference data against which results can be compared. So, for example, testing can detect certain stable isotopes in wood whose ratios vary by geography and can be used to determine origin if georeferenced samples of that species have been gathered and tested in advance to provide a basis of comparison. An immense effort is now underway to build libraries of reference data, and the building industry can send a demand signal that supports their expansion. While by itself, declare, map, and test can't distinguish wood that's legal from what's illegal, it does create a mechanism for holding wood producers and traders accountable. And accountability is key because law-abiding companies will be highly motivated to pass tests, and their upstream suppliers will therefore be under great pressure to provide good information and not look the other way when offered cheap wood that may be illegal. When combined with other approaches, this is a powerful way to fight crime and support the many honest companies in the wood products industry. Now I want to come full circle back to the central question this program set out to answer. Is using wood in building construction a climate solution? There's a simplistic narrative out there that goes more or less as follows. Trees suck carbon out of the air that gets stored each time we log timber and use the wood in buildings and elsewhere. We reduce emissions by substituting this wood for other materials. And this process only continues if we keep on logging. The conclusion that follows is that the more we log, the better off we'll be. But hopefully by now it's clear that whether or not using wood will help us solve the climate crisis depends entirely on where the wood comes from, where it does not come from, and how it's harvested. A significant increase in wood use that's satisfied by an increase in environmentally harmful logging and contributes to forest degradation and deforestation will only deepen our problems. The key question is, will using more wood result in an overall decrease in atmospheric carbon and an increase in carbon stores? Without great advances in forest protection and stewardship, the answer is almost certainly not. In closing, here are some resources for sourcing wood responsibly, promoting climate-friendlier forestry, and avoiding illegal wood. FSC has a great website at buildwithfsc.com, and the big new development there is the Wood Finder, a tool for connecting with existing supply of FSC-certified products. Wait a couple of weeks before you check this out, though, because it's been undergoing a major upgrade, and the new version will be launched next week at Greenbuild. Other good resources of this website include a climate-smart wood group that you can join to gain information and share best practices, and a continuing education program accredited by AIA and GBCI. If you're interested in learning more about purchasing forest carbon credits, I recommend starting with the Climate Action Reserve website. Among other things, there's an offsets marketplace page where you can find listings of entities that sell these credits. I will say that right now you have to hunt for them, and there needs to be a more straightforward way to find them, such as brokers who manage a portfolio of registered forest carbon projects. This is something I'm working on, and I encourage others to support. There's a lot out there about illegal logging, but for those interested in best practices for avoiding illegal wood in building construction, I recommend checking out the Timber Traceability Lead Pilot Credit and the continuing education program that goes along with it. Finally, there's a wealth of information on forests and climate on the Sierra Club website, only a fraction of which we've covered in this program. And of course, you can support the club's efforts to advance forest protection and stewardship by making a contribution and becoming a member. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dominic for some closing remarks, and then we'll go into Q&A. Here are our email addresses, and also this webinar is being recorded, warts and all, and I'll send a link to the recording to all of you who've registered. You can email me if you'd like to receive a PDF of the slide deck. All right, Dominic, I'm going to see if I can unmute you here.
Can you hear me?
Okay, Dominic, you are unmuted. I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Hopefully everyone else can too. Yeah,
all right.
I can hear you.
Okay, thanks, Jason. Very well done presentation. I don't have much to add. I've already been monitoring some of the traffic on the chat box.
Hey, Dominic?
Well. Yeah.
Dominic, let me stop you. You're echoing.
I know, yeah.
Well,
Not sure what to do.
Okay, well then echo on.
All right, so I think the only thing I would add is primary forests are so exceptionally rare. There's only about a third of the world's total forests that are still primary. And those are places that absolutely need to be off limits to logging. And I think you covered that well in your presentation. I think there's some questions on the chat board involving illegal logging and FSC. that given the echo effect here, Jason, maybe we should turn to the questions.
Okay, well that's unfortunate, Dominic. I tried muting on my side and I still got an echo. But I agree, and I'm sorry that we can't get more of your remarks, but hopefully you can handle some of the questions and folks can hear you. So please type your questions into the chat if you haven't already. I'm going to scroll back here and see what I can find. Okay. Do you have sources for data about illegal logging, and how does FSC address this? Yes, I have lots of sources for the data about illegal logging. So contact me afterwards and I'll be happy to send you citations and references. How does FSC address the illegal logging problem? So this is a very, very tough thing for FSC and all other forest certification systems. There's no easy answers here. But what FSC is doing is they are actively contributing to the gathering of the reference data that I referred to. So FSC is now setting up protocols where every time there's an annual audit of an FSC certified forest, the auditor will collect reference samples, and those will be fed into centralized libraries. The U.S. Forest Service Forest Products Laboratories involved in the collection of reference data, and also Kew Gardens in the UK. And so this ever accumulating body of data will help FSC and others trace wood and start tackling this problem of illegal wood and legal wood being commingled. So I personally think that FSC is way ahead of the curve from anything else that I know in addressing this, and illegal wood does find its way into FSC supply chains today. The other thing I can tell you is that FSC is setting up a system for a blockchain method for tracing quantities through the FSC system. But again, that's not a fail-safe against screening out illegal wood. Okay, here's another one. Is it possible to get wood legally certified when it's being clear-cut from a national forest? Would you like to take that one, Dominic?
Not sure if we still have that echo problem or not. How's it sounding?
A bit. I can hear you. Why don't you take a stab at it?
Okay, could you repeat the question? It was reverbing on my side.
Okay. Is it possible to get wood legally certified when it's being clear cut from a national forest?
Okay, yeah. So there hasn't been any certification of national forest at this time. There's an effort underway to consider national forest certification, but so far it's still being discussed, and the Forest Service has not asked for an FSC audit at this time. That may change. And incidentally, FSC certification does not prohibit clear-cut logging. There are restrictions on the size of clear cuts, but you can still clear cut under FSC certification.
Great. Okay. Well, we still do have a pretty bad echo, Dominic. So maybe you can weigh in on the chat, and I'll field questions, and we'll handle it that way. Okay, we have another one here. Is it reasonable to say, then, that we should not demolish wood buildings as much as possible? That is, extend the stored wood products' lives. That we should not demolish wood buildings as much as possible. Yes, we should extend the life of all buildings as much as possible, and do as much reuse and refurbishing and as little new construction as possible. That's absolutely the best thing that we should do. And of course, if we can find a way to deconstruct buildings and reuse wood and other materials, that's also a great way to reduce the impacts, the carbon and other impacts. So deconstruction and avoiding reuse is absolutely an important part of the solution. And I'm getting background noise.
You can mute me, Jason.
I'm thinking that might be you. Okay,
yeah.
I'm gonna mute you. All right. Okay. All right, Dominic, I'm not seeing you in the list of participants. I don't know what's going on, but if you could maybe mute on your end, that would be terrific. Okay, I'm moving to the next one. Is there information on how prevalent illegal logging is within the US and Canada? Yes, there is information. Contact me if you'd like more, but net, while there is illegal logging in US and Canada, it's a very low risk compared to the geographies where illegal logging is prevalent. I've heard that some states like California have such strict logging requirements that FSC is not needed. Is there any truth to that? FSC in California does require improvements over the regulatory floor. The spread between FSC standards and California regulations is less than the spread between FSC standards and states where the regulatory floor is relatively low, like Oregon. So it's less expensive for companies in California to change their forest management practices to meet FSC standards than it is for companies in Oregon. And that's one reason that there's a lot more FSC certified forest in California than there is in Oregon and Washington and some other states where the regulatory floor is low. Okay, we have another question. How easy is it to source FSC certified mass timber products such as CLT? Is it widely available or only certain CLT suppliers? It's only certain CLT suppliers. I'm only aware of 2 suppliers that have FSC certification today. And then of course there's underlying issues about the supply of FSC certified lumber to make the CLT. So you have to look for it. You have to be willing to pay a little bit more. But of course, the more the art market demands it, the more it will become available. So I still think it's very important for people to try. Can you please speak to other biogenic resources that can store carbon in buildings? Straw, hemp, tree, bamboo. I'm not an expert in this area, but of course, if it's a plant, it sequesters carbon. Straw and hemp and bamboo, I think everyone knows, they grow very fast. And so building buildings out of those materials makes a lot of sense to me as long as the rice or wheat or hemp or bamboo is responsibly produced. You know, there's not a lot of chemicals and stuff like that, or you're not clearing rainforest and planting bamboo. You still get into issues about how it's produced and where it's produced, but in general, it seems to me you're using byproducts, and it's a really good thing. How the carbon, the overall, the LCA for the carbon footprint compares to wood, I just don't know. For those of you who know David Arkin, and I could share his, I think I could share his contact if you contact me. I should probably ask him first, but he is a real leader and expert in this area, so I would probably defer to him. What impact does the growth of boreal forest due to global warming have on forest carbon balance? Geez, I don't really know the answer. Again, I could point people to experts on the boreal, but what I do know is that climate change actually poses a big threat in the boreal because of the melting of permafrost and the release of soil carbon, of forest soil carbon. So even if the trees are growing more, I mean, that would obviously sequester carbon, but it seems to me that there could be a risk of those gains being lost because of the release of soil carbon. Dominic, does that sound right?
You want to unmute me? Here we go.
You're unmuted. Yeah.
The boreal forest is one of the world's biggest carbon sinks. And anytime logging occurs in those forests, we lose most of that carbon to the atmosphere. So not a good place to be cutting down trees, especially the soils, which accumulate carbon over very long periods of time.
Okay, great. And by the way, Dominic, you're not echoing anymore. So
oh, good.
That's good news. Yeah. Let's see. Our next question is, how do you view other forest certification programs like SFI compared to FSC? If you can't get FSC wood, is SFI better than nothing? So my personal view of SFI, everything that I know, it's definitely a much lower standard than FSC. Many of the major industrial timber companies, such as Weyerhaeuser and Weyerhaeuser's all over, Sierra Pacific, Million Acres in California, all these companies manage forests intensively, or tree farms intensively, in the ways that were described in this program. Does SFI provide any benefit over the regulatory floor? Yes, I think it does. It has strengths in certain areas like logger training and education. They fund some conservation programs. So I do think that SFI is better than nothing, but I don't think it's going to get us a lot of gains in terms of climate-friendlier forestry, increasing carbon stores in working forests the way that FSC can. Dominic, you want to weigh in?
Well, I typed something on the chat, but I basically agree with you, Jason. It's just when you're starting at a very low bar, if you just notch it up a bit, maybe that's an improvement, but it really is a standard developed by industry for industry, and it doesn't have third-party verification. So I would avoid it personally and look for FSC as much as possible.
Okay, could you redefine pro-forestation? Very briefly, it means letting forests that are relatively mature, secondary forests that have been, their carbon stores and other environmental benefits have been reduced by past logging, but they're still relatively intact, and they have a lot of relatively mature trees. And it means protecting them and letting them grow. And because the trees are older, and because older trees add more carbon every year than young trees and little tiny trees, pro-forestation can
on the ground, reflecting sunlight back into space instead of the forest absorbing that heat energy. I think that if you cut down the trees, though, the net effect is to release most of the carbon for even the you've got snow reflectance in those forests is not going to really change the carbon balance much. So I don't really buy the argument for a temperate forest. It applies to a certain extent in the boreal, but you still have to account for the emissions when you cut those trees down. And when you look at the net carbon difference, you're still emitting more carbon to the atmosphere than you would be getting from a positive albedo effect. Jason, are you back online? All right, I'll answer the next one. What do you say about beetle-killed wood as a source of wood? It was on the screen a minute ago, but it probably got pushed down a bit. So I think, anytime we take wood out of the forest, it's going to have an impact, right? There's no such thing as a free lunch. And in the case of beetle-killed trees, for example, I work a lot in the Rockies where there's a lot of beetle kill from the US into Canada. And some of those are primary forests that have experienced insect infestations. And the kind of post-disturbance logging or so-called salvage logging is very impactful to forest ecosystems. And when those forests are logged, even if they've been killed by beetles, it has pretty substantial impacts on the ability of forests to come back. So I know it's out there. I know it, some people prefer the characteristics of beetle killed or even fungal killed trees, but you don't get something for nothing, and the impacts of salvage logging can actually be greater than impacts from logging green trees. Okay, so do certain species of wood sequester more carbon than others? And there's an example of radiated pine here. The answer to that is yes. It depends on a number of factors, including the species itself, its growth patterns, site conditions, the climate. For instance, trees growing in coastal rainforests along Oregon and Washington are going to grow much quicker, have much more carbon-rich soils than what you're going to get in drier forest conditions that have slower growth rates. And so the growth rate determines how quickly you're sequestering carbon. So the answer to that is yes. Is climate region more or less important than species? Hardwood versus softwood in general, or all important? I would say all of the above. And it's similar to the prior question that you got to take into consideration all those factors that you could get quicker growth out of hardwoods in the Northeast, for instance, compared to maybe the Southwestern United States softwoods. And so a difference, therefore, in sequestration. So you got to kind of consider biogeography, growth rates, species composition, soil characteristics. There's a lot involved in this.
Hey, Dominic, can you hear me?
I can.
We have just another minute or so in the time we have scheduled. I personally could go longer if people want to stay on. I don't know what your time is like, Dominic, but I wanted to jump onto these questions that came in at the very end, which are the only ones that I can see, because I think these are questions that come up a lot, or arguments that come up a lot, and I'd love to hear what you have to say about this piece about how some CLT producers harvest small trees that grow faster. Sounds like this is a good approach for the climate rather than using older, larger trees. Is this correct? And then someone jumps on that and says, I have a similar question. I'm wondering about the flip side. Is this worse because the smaller trees are absorbing less carbon in their short life? And the continual harvesting is releasing more and more soil carbon.
Yeah, very good question. And like so many answers in science, it depends on a number of factors. And so if there was a choice to be made between cutting small trees versus cutting old growth big trees, I think the small trees win out in terms of the sacrifice, if you will, compared to the old trees, because you've got to consider not just sequestration, but the storage of carbon in those big trees. But you could have a landscape where you are cutting at a very frequent rate, even small trees, that you've got too many holes in the bucket. So even if you don't have old trees on that landscape, if you're cutting at a very rapid rate, you're going to be emitting more carbon than you're sequestering. So one way to deal with that would be to lengthen the time between timber harvests so that you can start storing more carbon even in those logged landscapes.
Yeah. Here's a big one, Dominic. Again, I'm going to put you on the spot. Is a tremendous amount of logging going on after fires in California justified by environmental considerations? And then adding on to that, one small point to add to the small trees discussion: the small trees are the most dangerous when it comes to fire conditions in California. I know you have a lot of research in this area.
Yeah, so very good question. Thanks, Grace, it looks like, that submitted that. I think a number of issues need to be discussed quickly here. One is that many of the fires that are burning in California now, or most of them, are not occurring in forests. They're mostly in chaparral, shrub, oak, woodlands, grassland systems where people have built homes. That's not to say that the fire isn't affecting forest as well. But I've written a lot on the ecological benefits of forest fires that are occurring in California, Oregon, and Washington. The forests really need to have fire in their system, especially dry forests. I think the worst thing we could be doing to those forests after they burned is salvage logging, because it's the most impactful of all the impacts. You've already got a system that has experienced fire, and now you're going to pile on logging machinery, and think about what that's going to do to the soils, invasive species. And then we did publish a study a few years ago looking at this question about what burns in the highest intensity fires. Is it areas that have been logged before and after a fire, or is it the protected areas? And based on a very large data set, what we found was the areas that had most of the logging and most of the small trees were burning in higher levels of intense forest fires, and the areas that were protected were burning more in a mixed mosaic of fire intensities.
Great. There's a very simple narrative out there around fire suppression in forests or fire mitigation. This is a whole huge topic of itself. I'd encourage people to reach out to me or Dominic for more information on. Here's one that I would love to tackle. How can we more accurately calculate the carbon footprint LCA analysis would use in the project? Is there a good database, or would a specific product EPD provide good data? So like I said in the program, there are no good methods today for incorporating the impacts of forest management in LCA analyses, and those are being pursued. The assumption is that forest carbon is always neutral, and that's true whether you have planted the trees that you've harvested 40 years before and you've gained a lot of carbon storage, or whether you've gone in and clear-cut old growth and you've generated a huge carbon debt. The assumption is always that it's neutral. So it's this giant gap in the data. Now, the good news is I was at a carbon-friendly forestry conference yesterday, and I saw a presentation by some experts, including the scientist who was the lead researcher for the EcoTrust study that I mentioned. And he is modeling a very interesting approach to getting at this data. FSC is also working with these and other experts on a jurisdictional basis, so that is in geographies, which is going to mean a lot of averaging. Still, I think it can be directly accurate to show spread between FSC forestry in those geographies and the regulatory floor in terms of carbon storage, and then that could feed in to LCAs and EPDs. I think it's going to be really imperfect. I think some will challenge the science, but it's better than what we have today, which is nothing. And so I think there's exciting development in these areas, and when and if this happens, then people can start to differentiate between an EPD for forestry, for wood from climate-friendlier forestry as opposed to wood from conventional forestry. And that's when product-specific EPDs that make that differentiation will become possible. But until then, We just don't, we don't have the tools yet. Well, the questions keep flowing in. Dominic, what's your time yet? It looks like you still have a lot of people hanging in there, and I can keep going for, let's say, 1:15.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we'll keep rolling for another 8 minutes or so for those who want to hang in there. Dominic, do you want to tee up the next question?
Yeah, why don't you read it for the echo effect on my side?
Okay. Well, I'm missing questions that were asked before 12:56, but we'll just roll with what we have. Let's see, we have a question about biogasification to produce biochar and processing of waste results in forest thinning. How can we move forward?
Yeah, I think that is an interesting question, and I know there's a lot of interest in biochar in general, and like anything else, we would need to see a specific carbon analysis done on that, because anytime you take carbon or trees out of the forest, you've got to deal with the difference. And if you could at least resolve some of that through biochar, yeah, that would decrease the rate of loss of the carbon you're removing from the forest. But like so many other things, it depends on how much thinning you're doing, over what kind of a landscape, how big is the landscape, what are the kind of trees that you're taking, are you taking big trees, are you taking small trees? So all of that has to go into the carbon budget in order to determine the delta or the difference is. And if you're starting with small trees, and you're turning that into biochar, you're going to have a much smaller delta than if you're starting with big trees and you're turning some of that into biochar.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The thing is that everybody has to sign it. You've got the people there, and then you have to be able to scan it.
We're picking somebody else up, by the way. Someone's going to hit mute on your phone.
Yeah, if you could mute, that would be great. Well,
an affidavit is required. Kendra made one. If
someone is talking over the top here, referring to Kendra, please mute your phone.
All right, I think they did. Let's see. Dominic, I don't see any more questions on my end, but I can't see the questions before 12:56. So unless you can, and you can field those questions, well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to take a chance, and I'm going to unmute everyone, and maybe we can go for another 5 minutes, unless you can see those type questions. Can you, Dominic?
Yeah, I can, but I've already answered a bunch of them. If you want to unmute, that's fine.
Okay. Well, I'm going to unmute. A lot of people drop.
We normally do that. I think.
Anyone else have questions? Anyone have a question they want to ask? All right. Well, seems like we're done. So thanks everyone for taking the time to join. Feel free to reach out to your Dominic. Hopefully, I'll see Greenville.
All done? Okay. Hey, thanks, everybody. You can also get information from my website, forestlegacies.org.
Terrific. Okay. Everyone have a good day.